Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Harvard Law Forum, the longest-running American law school speaker series. I'm Pete Davis, 3L. This is my penultimate forum. My final one is tomorrow. And we've had wonderful people at the forum over our last 70 years, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, JFK, Jimmy Carter, and joining them today is Corey Robin. My biggest gripe with Harvard Law School is that it pretends to exist outside of time. When you learn about one appellate decision after another, we do not discuss the history of how the law got made, the future of how the law could be different, or the present of how the law works in the real world today. If we can do better at teaching the history of the law, we can cut the present order down to size, showing how it came to be and how that process was often less reasonable than one would expect. If we can do better at teaching the future of the law, if we can discuss not just how to navigate the legal order, but also how to change it, then we will be better prepare ourselves to join our forebears in co-creating our social order. And finally, if we do a better job at teaching the present of the law, if we expanded our curriculum beyond case studies to include direct experience with the realities of the justice system, then we would learn not just how to think like attorneys, advocates for specific clients, but also how to think like lawyers, members and caretakers of the legal profession. I wanted to invite Corey Robin to the forum because Corey knows about time. He doesn't see our current politics in an ahistorical vacuum, one random awful thing after another, but is rather a wizard at understanding and explaining how the present fits into history. And in doing that, he can see the realities of the present and the possibilities of the future much more clearly. He teaches political science at Brooklyn College and the CUNY Graduate Center. He is the author of The Reactionary Mind, which has been called one of the most influential political works of the last decade, and the book that predicted Trump. His writings have appeared in the New York Times, Harper's, Jacobin, and the London Review of Books. He is here to share his insights on the history of the right and what it can tell us about the rise of Donald Trump, the future of Trumpism, and what we can do in response. Let's hear it for Corey Robin.
I got to turn this thing on here. I think, can you all hear me now? Okay, great. Thank you for that very warm welcome and introduction. I want to begin today with what may be, for some of you, a very controversial claim. And that is, as we head into the second year of the Trump administration, there are multiple signs, many signs that the conservative movement, the Republican Party, and Trump's presidency are in trouble, each showing symptoms of terminal weakness and a core confusion and even incoherence. And I want to say again up front that I know this may come to some of you as a very counterintuitive claim. I understand that, but I hope you'll bear with me as I try to make the case. There are, as I said, many signs of trouble. There are first the ominous defeats that Republicans have suffered in special elections since November 2016, some of them in deep Trump country, in the gubernatorial race in Virginia, in the Senate race in Alabama, in the congressional race in Western Pennsylvania, and in state legislative and judicial races in Wisconsin and elsewhere. There is strong possibility of a wave election in the House come November. There are 39, well, actually now, given this morning's news, 40 Republicans in Congress who have announced plans not to seek re-election. That is not only more than twice the number of Democrats who have so announced, but it's also, this is an interesting factoid, the highest number of Republicans to have made such an announcement in Congress since 1930. I wrote this, I should say, 5 days ago, true story, and I had my second point. There's been tremendous speculation that Paul Ryan may be stepping down, and in part because of the fact that his agenda, only one part of it really has been successful, the tax cuts, not Obamacare repeal. not the gutting of entitlements and welfare. Usually everybody running for the exit signs is not a sign of a party that is in ascendancy or firmly in control. There are multiple reports since last summer's confrontation in Charlottesville, Virginia, of the radically weakened state of the alt-right, including the announcement by Richard Spencer that they are essentially closing up shop, stopping all public events. Considering that the alt-right was supposed to be the equivalent to previous popular modes of conservative organizing on the right, that is the moral majority, the Christian right, or the Tea Party, that announcement from Spencer and the reports we're seeing is quite a big deal. There is the fact that so many of Trump's signature positions, in particular hostility to immigration and free trade, are more unpopular today than they were on the day of the election. According to the latest NBC Wall Street Journal poll, support for international trade is at an all-time high, and in 9 out of 10 states that Trump won, according to a more recent poll, strong majorities are in favor of DACA. Trump's effect on public opinion, in other words, is to make the positions that he takes more unpopular, not more popular. There is the enormous backlash to conservative policies that we're seeing right now in red states like West Virginia, Kentucky, Oklahoma, and Arizona, a backlash that is not just about education and teacher pay, but is, I think, about the systematic defunding of public priorities that has been the hallmark of the Republican Party since 1978, when Proposition 13 in California was first passed. And then there is also the failure of the Republican Party to repeal Obamacare. Some people tend to forget about this. And particularly the part of Obamacare, namely the expansion of Medicaid, that is the part that was the most like the Great Society and the New Deal. That was the most difficult part they had in repealing Obamacare. But I want to focus instead, those are just some of the highlights that one can go through. I want to focus instead on something that very few people are talking about, and that is the budget that the Republican-controlled Congress recently passed. This was a budget that was so inimical to the policies and priorities of the Trump administration that Trump threatened to veto it, although, as with so many of his threats, it was more bluster than anything else. He backed down in the end and signed the budget. I want to focus on the budget for two reasons. First, a lot of the discussion of the power of Trump and the right, particularly in the media and on social media, focuses on the unilateral action that Trump and his subordinates have taken in the executive branch. So late last year, there was a report on CNN that Trump is on track to have passed the most executive orders of any president in the last half century. Now, given the regulatory scope and power of the presidency, it makes sense that we would focus on these types of actions. But what we forget is that one of the reasons that presidents opt for executive orders is that they can't get something through Congress. We saw this, in fact, under Obama quite a bit. The difference was that where Obama was not forced to rely on executive orders until well into his second term in office, and whereas Obama had to confront a Congress that was completely under the control of the opposition, Trump has been forced to rely upon executive orders from the very beginning, despite the fact that his party is completely in control of Congress. The Obama precedent points to another flaw in this focus on executive orders. Anything that a president does by executive order can be undone by his or her successor, as we're now seeing, in fact, with Trump, who is trying to undo what Obama did. So rather than paying too much attention to this independent executive action, I think a better gauge of the power of Trump and the standing of the right is the degree to which they can get their conservative agenda through Congress. And that's part of why I want to focus on the budget. The second reason why is that a lot of the discussion of Trump on the right, particularly among people on the left, I've found, is this focus on his tweets, on his words and his rhetoric, as ugly as they are, on the assumption that somehow what a president says becomes fact, becomes the equivalent of law. And I find this focus odd, I guess, for a couple of reasons. First of all, under Obama, many liberals in both the media and academia made a cottage industry out of poking fun of people particularly on the left, who thought that if only Obama would speak more passionately and forcefully, if only Obama took his bully pulpit more seriously, he'd be able to push a more radical program through Congress. This was called the Green Lantern theory by a lot of liberals in the media. And their point was that the presidency is an inherently weak institution and that there's nothing weaker in the institution than a president's words. Suddenly that all has seemed to change. And what now seems to matter to people is what a president says, regardless of what that president does. So I would like to take a different tack and focus not so much on what Trump and the right say, at least in this first part of this talk, but on what they spend. Joseph Schumpeter, the great economist, once wrote, "The spirit of a people, its social structure, all this and more is written in its fiscal history." That's the budget, in other words. Its fiscal history stripped of all phrases. He who knows how to listen to its message here discerns the thunder of world history, end quote. In a budget, in other words, you see what a country, or in this case, the conservative movement, and its elected officials really think and are capable of doing, whether they are willing to put their money where their mouth is. So what is the message, the thunder of world history, that we see in this budget that was recently passed, I think less than a month ago, about 3 weeks ago? According to The Atlantic, this is a, quote, domestic budget to make Barack Obama proud, end quote. We are here in a university, so let's start with the things that universities care most about themselves. Trump and the conservatives in Congress wanted to radically cut funding for the National Science Foundation and the National Institute of Health. They also wanted to eliminate completely the National Endowment for the Humanities and the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. In this budget that they just passed and that Trump just signed, Congress increased funding for all 4 agencies. Trump wanted to cut funding for Pell Grants and Head Start. Congress increased funding for both. Betsy DeVos, the Secretary of Education, wanted to cut the budget of the DOE, which conservatives, remember, since Reagan have wanted to completely eliminate, just get rid of it. She wanted to cut that budget by $9 billion. Congress increased that budget by nearly $3 billion, higher than the levels that even Obama funded it as. Let's turn to immigration, a subject around which many on the left and liberals have a great deal of legitimate and justifiable concern. A lot of the attention in the immigration debate in politics has focused on the wall that Trump wants to build. Trump and the hard-right Republicans wanted $25 billion for the wall. He got $1 billion and change, almost all of it expressly earmarked for repairs on existing barriers and what's called secondary fencing. In other words, very little devoted to any new fencing. Trump was so pissed about this that the first thing he did was to call for the military to pay for the wall out of its own budget. That's not happening. And now he's made this move to bring the National Guard in to head for the border. Interestingly, at levels and numbers that are lower than what George W. Bush did in his administration. Like those executive orders that I talked about earlier, both of these responses of Trump's are examples not of presidential power, but of presidential weakness. Unable to get his program through Congress, he's left to bluster on Twitter. But the real story about immigration and the budget, I think, lies elsewhere. As Dara Lind recently reported in Vox, Trump wanted money for more than 1,000 new ICE agents. Congress cut that request back to 100, none of which of those agents are going to be allowed to be engaged in anything like arrest or detainment. Congress also put very tight financial restrictions on how many immigrants ICE can hold at any one time. And Trump and the hard right, remember, wanted to deny funding to sanctuary cities. Congress refused to go along with it. Trump wanted to cut funding to Planned Parenthood. Congress refused to make any cuts to Planned Parenthood. Trump wanted to cut funding to the EPA by 31%. Congress refused to make any cuts to the EPA. I want to make sure we go through all of this because I think there's a very powerful sense that people have of the power of these people And I think it's important to kind of look at some of these hard material realities. Trump wanted to cut funding for renewable energy by 65%. Congress increased funding for renewable energy by 14%. Trump wanted to cut funding for the Health and Human Services budget. Congress increased it by almost 20% to almost exactly what Obama had asked for in his last budget. According to Politico, this is a budget that, quote, not only protects Obama's priorities, it expands them. It does far less for Trump's stated priorities. Now remember, after the passage of the tax cuts late last year, so this would have been November, December, the word from Paul Ryan and the Republicans was, great, we're just going around second base, we're headed for third, and we're going to go home. And what they meant by that was, we're going to now gut the entitlement state and get rid of the liberal welfare state. None of that has happened. And that's part of the reason, of course, why Paul Ryan is retiring. So what this really means is that we're going to get close to the end of Trump's second year in office with 2 years of budgets that look remarkably like those of Barack Obama. So, whether we are taking the measure of the right by public opinion polls, by the electoral results since Trump's election, by the policy record, by the resilience of the movement's apparatus and its para-apparatus, or the basic ability of Trump and the right to transform in their favor the dominant assumptions of the political conversation, the way Ronald Reagan and George W. Bush did, I think we'd have to say that the right is doing remarkably badly. And I say remarkably badly because if I had told you in the immediate aftermath of the 2016 election that any of this was likely to happen, when all anyone could see was that Trump and the Republicans were firmly in control of all the elected branches of government, you would have said that I was crazy. And I know this is so because I did say a lot of this at the time, and you, or at least a lot of my readers, whoever they are, did say that I was crazy. But I think the fact of the matter is, if you look at Trump in historical perspective, compare him to the presidencies of George W. Bush, Ronald Reagan, or even Richard Nixon, and when I say compare them, I'm not talking about who's the worst person, who's the worst, the more radical right wing. I'm just saying in terms of their ability to execute the basic agenda that they're elected to office to execute. The fact of the matter is they are doing remarkably badly in comparison. Now, to understand that, and this is what I'd like to do with my remaining time, I think we need to step back, and back, I mean way back, to the history of conservatism and the right as a whole. And what I'm going to talk about for the remainder of the time is, first of all, what is conservatism? Second, how and why is Trump continuous with the conservative tradition? And then thirdly, I'm going to come back to this question that I was posing really at the beginning of how and why it is that conservatism, which was once in ascendancy and such a source of potency for the Republican Party, how it is that it has now become a liability and shows signs of being in terminal crisis. So let's begin with conservatism, what it is. So around the year 2000, which always has this very biblical sound to it, but the 200, that year, 2000, I did something that many people on the left rarely do, which is that I began reading and teaching the conservative canon. That is from Edmund Burke, the British philosopher and statesman, and Joseph de Maistre, the French philosopher and statesman, all the way up through contemporary versions of conservatism. And what I found is that from the very beginning, and by the very beginning, I mean in the reaction against the French Revolution in the 1790s, which is when conservatism begins as a tradition, in reaction against the French Revolution of the 1790s, from the very beginning, conservatism has been a politics of reaction. The reactionary politics of the right, in other words, did not originate with Donald Trump. It did not originate with the Tea Party, with George W. Bush, with Newt Gingrich, with Ronald Reagan, Richard Nixon, or Barry Goldwater. Reaction has been a defining element of conservatism from the very beginning. So what is conservatism a reaction against? First and foremost, it is a reaction against reformist or radical or revolutionary movements of the left. Now, notice I do not make a distinction here between reformist movements and policies, let's say something like the New Deal, and radical or revolutionary movements and policies and programs. And the reason I don't make that distinction is not because that distinction doesn't exist. It's because conservatives across the board have been opposed to all of these movements, whether in Europe or the United States. What conservatism does not like in either reform or radicalism or revolution is not necessarily, and this is very important, it's not necessarily the specific content or policies of the program. So for instance, some conservatives, a lot today obviously, are very much in favor of the free market. Many have historically been very much opposed to the free market. Some conservatives have favored the welfare state. Bismarck was one of the pioneers of the modern welfare state. Others have opposed the welfare state. Some conservatives like big cataclysmic wars, others oppose them. What is it that conservatives then oppose in these reformist, radical, or revolutionary movements of the left? In my reading, it is the assertion of power and the assertion of agency by a subordinate class of people. The refusal of that subordinate class, which was once submissive and continues to be submissive, the refusal of that class to be submissive anymore. The insistence by that subordinate class that they have a role to play in the governance of their personal and collective lives. That is what conservatism opposes in all these movements of reform, radicalism, or revolution. As Edmund Burke declared of the French Revolution in February 1790, so this is long before the terror happens, this is long before the execution of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, this is long before the full violence of the French Revolution breaks out. This is what he said: "The real object of the revolution is to break all those connections, natural and civil, that regulate and hold the community together by a chain of subordination. To raise soldiers against their officers, servants against their masters, tradesmen against their customers, artificers against their employers, tenants against their landlords, curates against their bishops, and children against their parents." That last one, I have some sympathy with him on that. End quote. Conservatism is always and everywhere a defense of the rule of the superior over the subordinate, against the forces of reform and revolution that would undo that rule. Even in its most American and its most populist variants, and that's a topic I'm going to come back to in a second, conservatism takes its cues and imaginings from the oldest of Europe's old regimes. As none other than Donald Trump put it in his great work, The Art of the Deal, quote, "What I'm doing is about as close as you're going to get in the 20th century to the quality of Versailles," end quote. Now, at the same time that conservatism is a defense of these existing hierarchies of rule and systems of domination, it has also offered, and this is one of the most surprising things that I found, a scorching critique of existing elites, of existing traditional elites. The problem with existing elites, according to the right, according to conservatives, is that those elites are too weak, too soft, too unskilled to defend their privileges and the inequalities of the old regime. From Joseph de Maistre, who opens his considerations on France with this couplet from a Racine poem expressing his contempt for the nobility of the church. This is the quote that de Maistre cites, quote, and the you that's being addressed is the nobility in the church. "Now see the sad fruits your faults have produced. Feel the blow you have yourselves induced," end quote. So from de Maistre to Barry Goldwater, whose very first paragraph in The Conscience of the Conservative is an attack not on the Democratic Party, not on liberals, not on the welfare state, but on the Republican establishment. To more recently, Trump himself, who had this to say in The Art of the Deal, quote, If there's one thing I've learned about the rich, it's that they have a very low threshold for even the mildest discomfort, end quote. Conservatives have always felt that the biggest problem with the ruling class is the ruling class itself. Elite privilege, elite power, the ease and the comfort that comes from that privilege and power have made those elites, in the idea and the vision of the right, ill-suited to exercise the kind of domination and rule that are necessary to keep the lower orders enthralled. Those elites must be educated, they must be transformed, or if not successfully educated or transformed, cashiered and eliminated, if the regime is to recover or revive its power. So this critique of the elite. Now, alongside of this critique of the elite, another very surprising part of the conservative canon that I discovered is that conservatives have often expressed a not-so-secret admiration for their enemies on the left. Conservatives believe that the left has a greater faith in its cause, greater clarity about its aims and purposes, and often greater talent than the ruling elites of the old regime. As Burke wrote of the Jacobins of his day, of the revolutionaries of his day, quote, inability, not inability, in dexterity, in the distinctness of their views, the Jacobins are our superiors, end quote. So conservatives have studied and learned from the left, borrowing its vocabulary and imitating the left. Again, Burke, quote, to destroy that enemy being the Jacobins, by some means or other, the force opposed to it, namely us, the right, the counter-revolution, the force opposed to it should be made to bear some analogy and resemblance to the force and spirit which that system exerts. We on the right need to mobilize an amount of force that bears some analogy and resemblance to the very force and spirit of that which we are opposing. So what is it that conservatives learn from the left? First, the appeal to the masses. The smartest conservatives have understood that they need to connect, or at least reconnect, with the very little people, the lower orders, whose allegiance they have lost. The way to do that, argues the conservative, is to give the masses a taste of power. To reconnect with the mass, you have to find some way to empower the mass, not with the full realities of power, but as I said, with a taste of power. The right does this in a few ways. The first way is to create ever finer gradations of power and rank within the ruling hierarchy itself, so that people on the lower tiers can experience not merely submission to those above them, but also domination of those beneath them. Here the point is to play off what economists today call the last place aversion. That is, economists and psychologists have found that people often will put up with any amount of inequality and superiority above them, so long as they are not on the very bottom, so long as there is someone beneath them. So this is how one of the more illustrious alums of this great university, John Adams, this is how he described this. John Adams did go to Harvard, right? Okay, phew. Everybody went to Harvard? This is how John Adams describes it in his discourses on Davila. Quote, not only the poorest mechanic, but the man who lives upon common charity, nay, the common beggars in the streets, court a set of admirers and plume themselves on that superiority which they have, or fancy they have, over some others beneath them. And in fact, he goes on to describe the story of this poor beggar in the street who's starving and refuses to sell his dog for money because he wonders, if I give away my dog, who's going to look up to me then? You always need something beneath you. Corporations and American firms are the masters of this kind of maneuver, that is, recruiting from the working classes the men and women who will staff the ever-growing ranks of middle and lower management. American capitalism, in fact, is well in the avant-garde in almost all other industrial societies in terms of the multiple ranks of management in corporate firms. So that's the first thing, create this gradation of ranks. The second way that they appeal to the mass is to create what I call democratic feudalism. And here the idea is less to create a society of many ranks than it is to redefine who is the ruling class and to conscript the lower orders into the ruling class to make them feel as if they are on the top. Now, the pioneers of this strategy were the master class of the slave South. They understood that in order to protect the slave system, you had to make slaveholding a democratic project for white people. They did this in a variety of ways, including a proposal to provide tax subsidies so that every white man could own a slave. Seems like the right has been doing tax subsidies for a very, very long time. But the most potent means of making feudalism democratic, they found, was to use racism, the ideology of white supremacy, as the basis for imagining a new, more democratic ruling class, a way of turning every white man into a little lord. As John C. Calhoun, Andrew Jackson's vice president and the leading theoretician of the Old South, observed, quote, "With us, the two great divisions of society are not the rich and poor, but white and black. And all the former, the poor as well as the rich, belong to the upper class and are respected and treated as equals." In other words, all white people, by virtue of the color of their skin, become the aristocracy, looking at each other as equal, and all other material considerations and gradations between them drift away and cease to be important. This is not just a symbolic or imaginary form of power. This gives white people, and particularly white men, real power, real domination in multiple forms over black people. The last way is more symbolic. So remember, one is to create these ever finer gradations within the hierarchy. Second way is just to create, democratize the ruling class as a whole and to divide society in two. And then another way, I mean, there are many, is through nationalism and imperialism, whereby the citizen of the nation, no matter how poor or downtrodden, can imagine him or herself to be part of a superior people who dominate the rest of the earth. So that's the first thing that conservatives learned from the left, the importance of the mass. The second thing conservatives have learned from the left is the importance of irregular and even violent transformative action. The revolutionary left has often made the case for the tactical and strategic importance of violence, with political violence being understood as an extension of the basic rules of warfare but applied to a domestic context. And in countering the left, the right also comes to its own appreciation of violence, but violence understood in very different terms, as a spectacular, irregular assertion of power and authority, as lawless action that not only affects the enemies of the right, that is the left, but affects the right itself. What these acts of violence and irregular assertions of power and lawlessness do is to generate an image of a ruling elite as being slightly unsteady, slightly irrational, a little off-kilter, as a force that is so unsteady and unstable that you have no idea what it might do. Shock and awe. From Burke, who said that, quote, "the madness of the wise is better than the sobriety of fools," to Trump, who says in the very first page of The Art of the Deal, "sometimes it pays to be a little wild," end quote. Conservatives have always been partial to the spectacle of lawless violence and grandeur. The idea is to generate among the mass awe before power, and among the elite, a rejuvenating element that forces established rulers and elites to up their game. Warfare is the ideal way of doing this. It's often unpredictable, it requires violence, and it features an element of risk and contingency that breaks with the routines of everyday life. But whether through warfare or some other means, conservatives will often present themselves as offering something new, something innovative, novel, irregular, and unfamiliar. No matter what, conservatives cannot be satisfied with small, prudential, and predictable steps. In Burke's words, this is Burke, quote, "every little measure is a great error. Or as Trump puts it, quote, "I like thinking big," end quote. So by now, I hope it's clear all the ways in which I think that Trump and Trumpism are consistent with conservatism as an intellectual and political tradition. The elitism that we talked about, there are a lot of ways in which Trump is a thoroughly conventional elitist Republican in the last 50 years. His signal success has been the tax cuts. Tax cuts are the cornerstone of modern conservatism. Their animating principle has always been that if you put money into the hands of the investor class, they will have the knowledge and the skill and the know-how where to spend that money in ways that are most beneficial to society, including the lower orders. So conservative tax cuts have always heavily skewed to the rich, though often with some kind of minimal populist gloss. Trump's tax cuts simply skew rich, which should come as no surprise. Up until recently, Trump's most influential and wealthy backer was the hedge fund billionaire Robert Mercer, who you were asking about before, whose values, according to the New Yorker, somebody in the New Yorker, a friend of his told somebody in the New Yorker that these are his values, quote, "Human beings have no inherent value other than how much money they make. If someone is on welfare, they have negative value. If he earns 1,000 times more than a school teacher, then he's 1,000 times more valuable." And you should think about that quote as we're seeing all these teacher strikes across the country. He's 1,000 times more valuable. Government helps the weak people get strong, and it makes the strong people weak by taking their money away through taxes. So the point of public policy is to get every dollar into the hands of the best man, the man who knows how to spend it well and wisely, for he is the true and natural leader of the society, the strongest, the savviest, the best. So you have a strong element of elitism. You also have a strong element of critique of other elites. For at the same time that Trump defends the power of wealth and the man of wealth, he's often been merciless in his attack on other elites, particularly elites in the Republican Party. I mean, we forget this, but how did Trump come to prominence within the Republican primary? It was in his attack on the other Republican, the entire establishment of the Republican Party. His favorite word throughout the primary was that his opponents were losers. And by that, he didn't just mean that they would lose to him, which they did. He meant something larger. He meant that they were losers leading a party of losers, and more generally, a nation and economy of losers. Like many conservatives, going back to Trump, I'm already imagining a world post-Trump. Going back to Burke, excuse me. Trump thinks that a key problem in America is the elite themselves, their weakness and their unwillingness to do what is necessary to win. And again, this is an old theme for Trump, going back to his Art of the Deal, which is filled with contempt for the stupidity, the lack of talent, the cowardice, the vacillations of America's ruling classes. Just one small example. I mean, there are many of this in the book, but he expresses a great admiration in the book for Conrad Hilton, who was the founder of the Hilton hotel chain, this economic empire. And one of the things that Hilton did was to refuse to pass on his wealth to his children on the grounds that, quote, this is Trump talking, "Inherited wealth destroys moral character and motivation." But Trump also expresses great contempt in the book for Conrad Hilton's son, who would go on, despite the father's wishes, to run the family business, precisely because he does inherit his position. And for those of you who follow these things, the name of Conrad Hilton's son was Barron, which is also the name that Trump has given his own son. So I'll leave you to parse the psychoanalytic meaning of all that. So there are many ways in which Trump is an elitist, that is, a believer that there is a small coterie of men who are just better and more excellent than other men, and they should be in charge of those other men and dominate them. And of course, women as well, it goes without saying. But is also sharply critical and contemptuous of American elites. Like many conservatives before him, Trump makes appeals, populist appeals to the masses. His favored tropes in this regard, of course, are his racism and his nationalism, and his favorite targets are Mexicans and Muslims. And what is he doing with those appeals? He's not just spreading hate or prejudice, although he is doing that. What he's really doing, and this again goes way back in the conservative tradition, is incorporating white people, no matter how poor or destitute, into an imaginary ruling class of superior beings who can dominate those beneath them. White Christian Americans then become superior to the rest of the world and other people who are not white Christian Americans in this country. Like many conservatives before him, Trump is proudly erratic and unsteady in his exercise of power. We've seen this throughout his time in office. And while there's a lot of evidence that unsteadiness and erraticness is actually preventing him from accomplishing his goals and the conservative movement's goals, I think we have to realize that one of the reasons why he is there and doing that is not because of him, but because these are values that are baked into the design of conservatism as a whole. That is what many people in the Republican primary found most appealing about Trump. It's not just the racism and the misogyny, it's the way that racism and misogyny signal a kind of willingness to break the rules. Political correctness was such a key thing in that campaign. And what is that about? It's saying that there are norms and manners and rules of how one ought to behave, and I'm that guy who can break them. That's how great I am. I don't have to follow the rules. So it's that notion of irregularity. And again, this goes way back to The Art of the Deal. This is how he describes the way he does business in that book. Quote, "Most people are surprised by the way I work." I mean, most people are surprised that he works at all. I play it very loose. I don't carry a briefcase. I try not to schedule too many meetings. I leave my door open. You can't be imaginative or entrepreneurial if you've got too much structure. I prefer to come to work each day and just see what develops, end quote. Which is exactly, if you follow the everyday governance of the White House, what he does in the White House. His entire campaign and now his presidency are premised on that notion that too much structure is bad. Everything should be played loose. So now we come to the question. If Trump's style and assumptions are continuous with conservatism past, why do they seem not to be delivering in the same way they did in the past? And by that, I ask you to refer back to that whole litany of things I cited at the beginning of the ways in which it was not delivering. But let me add a couple of other ways in which it's not delivering. Just think about elections going back to 1972, which is when Richard Nixon is reelected. Richard Nixon was, of course, the first successful practitioner of contemporary conservatives' kind of hard right, racist populism. He won 60.7% of the popular vote in 1972. 60.7%. At the height of his power, Ronald Reagan won 58.8% of the popular vote in 1984. At the height of his power, George W. Bush got 50.7% of the vote in 2004. I hope you're seeing what's happening here. And now Trump was just elected with 46% of the popular vote. And remember, in the case of the last two Republican presidents, we had elections for each of them where each of them lost the popular vote, something that had not happened in this country since the 19th century. I was going to make a related point on tax cuts, but you know what? In the interest of time, I'll bag it. But it's there if you want it. That falling popular support is more important than I think we realize, because the hallmark of conservatism from its very beginnings has been its ability to force a mass politics or to create and construct a mass politics of elitism, an elitist politics whose hallmark would be its popular and populist appeal. What Irving Kristol once said about neoconservatism and the Republican Party, I think applies to conservatism in generally. Quote, this is what he said: "The historical task and political purpose of neoconservatism," he wrote, "is to convert the Republican Party and American conservatism in general, against their respective wills, into a new kind of conservative politics that is suitable to governing in a modern democracy," end quote. What has always distinguished conservatism from merely reflexive defenses of established rule has been that popular touch, that ability to link the fate of the king to the fate of the commoner. What has distinguished conservatism is precisely that demotic appeal, that democratic style. That conservatism has now become a minority dispensation, by that I mean a numerical minority, that it has come to rely so much for its power, not on populism, but on the most sclerotic, anti-democratic institutions of the state, like the Electoral College, like gerrymandering, is not a sign of its power, but a sign of its weakening. And that's why, with the exception of the tax cuts and deregulation, again pursued mostly through the executive branch, not through Congress, the main area of the right's success has been its focus on the courts, something all of you people who study here care and know a lot about. Mitch McConnell and the Federalist Society know that the key to continuing conservative power is control over the courts, not the populist hegemony that people like Thatcher and Reagan helped forge. In fact, there was just a piece on Monday in the Washington Post saying that this is now the Republican Party line going into the midterms, and I would imagine after today's news of Ryan, even more so. The line is, we're going to lose the House. The only thing we should care about is holding on to the Senate in order to hold on to the courts. So think about that for a minute, what that means. The key institution of the conservative movement today is not the majoritarian lower house of representatives, but the most anti-democratic parts of the state apparatus, the Senate and the courts. The fact that the conservatism has come to be so reliant upon what is the equivalent of the Tories' rotten boroughs strategy of the early 19th century Britain is less the fulfillment of its elitism than a sign of the weakening of its populism. I'm coming to a close here. I think the reason why the Republicans are having such a hard time of it, despite being in control of all three elected branches of government, despite having so many states under Republican control, is that to a very large degree, conservatism has succeeded as a project. And it is that success that has made not just Trump, but conservatism and the Republican Party vulnerable. Remember how I defined conservatism earlier in this talk as a movement of reaction against an emancipatory movement of the left that seeks to empower the lower classes to speak and act on their behalf, to act as independent agents of their own destiny. Modern conservatism began as a movement first against the emancipation of the working classes. By modern, I mean 20th century conservatism. A movement against the emancipation of the working classes, then against the emancipation of African Americans, and finally against the emancipation of women. Conservatism didn't simply seek to stop the emancipation of those groups. It sought to stop those groups from seeking their own emancipation. Conservatism, in other words, is a counter-movement to defeat a movement. And I think for the most part, conservatism has succeeded in doing that. Certainly, the labor movement, to all intents and purposes, has been defeated by the right. But I would also say that despite the victories in representation, electoral representation of African Americans, the movement, the Black freedom movement and its goals as they were set out in the 1950s and 60s, has been significantly set back, if not defeated. Residential and school segregation, which was, of course, the original animating purpose of the Black freedom struggle, is worse today than it was under Ronald Reagan. The right to vote, the other pillar of the civil rights movement, is under assault in many states. The racial wealth gap today is larger than it's been in decades. But more important, despite the rise of Black Lives Matter, whose fate remains uncertain, the movement of Black citizens, the movement of Black freedom, seems to have been stalled for some time. And as for women, conservatives have had a somewhat, I think, tougher time there, but even so, women remain very much on the defensive. So overall, if we think of these various struggles, labor, African Americans, and women, as movements rather than simply as policy achievements, and I think this is, especially in places like law schools, these things get talked about as sort of policy goals and so forth. But I think from the conservative point of view, you have to think of these as movements. It's safe to say that conservatism, at least for the last half century, has had the bulk of the momentum on its side. But having won so many victories, its raison d'etre is now very much in doubt. Without an emancipatory left, a left that is genuinely seeking and potentially succeeding in dispossessing people of their power, the right's arguments and reasoning seem increasingly hollow. There remains, of course, roughly 1/3 to 2/5 of the country that is solidly committed to Trump and convinced of his rightness. But where presidents at the beginning of their terms usually have maximal sway to build beyond their electoral coalitions, Trump came into office with record high disapproval ratings that have been amongst the worst in the history of modern polling, and since then his approval ratings have only worsened, oscillating in the 35 to 42%. All the things that once transported conservatism into power, populism, racism, nationalism, the critique of established elites, now seem like major liabilities. One of the weakest moments for Trump, we forget, was right after Charlottesville. There you had Trump defending Confederate monuments and statues, and his disapproval ratings shot up. He was and even denounced by other Republicans. So let me close here with a caveat. My point is not that Trump and the Republicans can't get anything done. That would be a silly argument to make. On taxes, deregulation, and judges and immigration, they have been successful. And my point is not that they can't do harm or damage. They already have. But what I mean is, and what I'm concerned about in this talk, is with their ability to define and control the political field, to achieve the kind of full spectrum dominance that Reagan and even Bush once did. And I think that has been radically limited and constrained. The GOP's resources are entirely, at this point, or almost entirely, institutional and bureaucratic. Politically, they have very little authority and legitimacy. And if we return to that crystal quote that I cited earlier, that is a very dangerous and very weak position for conservatism to be in. Now, whether that means they're in for a rout at the polls in November or beyond, I have no idea, and I'm not making any predictions about that. Because I think the real question that's on the table is that in order to defeat something, you can't defeat something if you've got nothing to defeat it with. And so what I think that leaves for people on the left is an inward look to see whether or not this movement that on the right, which is really tottering, can be finally pushed over or not. And I think that is a very, very open question that people should not think is by any means settled or resolved. Thank you.
Some people are going to go to class, but we have about 10 minutes for questions.
Okay, so it's 10 minutes. I will promise to speak fast in my answers, but you have to speak fast in your questions and keep them short. Yes.
You mentioned that conservatives have been largely focused on retaining control of the levers of more anti-democratic powers, such as gerrymandering, voter suppression, and the courts. Their common defense of these things is that for gerrymandering, that their opponents are actually engaging in gerrymandering. For the courts, that their opponents are trying to stack the court politically, or with voter suppression, that their opponents are trying to game elections through voter fraud. Would this, does this really have what relevance does this have to the status of conservatism in terms of positively defending, their political projects in these areas?
I think very little, to be honest with you, because again, when conservatism has been in its ascendancy, it has not thought of itself as a project that depended so much so on these very anti-democratic levers. People find this very hard to accept, but what marked Reagan and Thatcher, and who are the two most successful practitioners of conservative politics in the sort of post-war era, was precisely that they wanted to forge a common majority, a project where they had firm electoral authority, that all parties engage in gerrymandering, and I think the evidence there is quite the case. I mean, if you look at liberal gerrymandering in the 70s, it's not well. There are people who have much greater expertise on this than I do, so I won't go there. But But my simple point is that they have now put all their eggs into that basket. That's what's most significant, not the reasons why they give for it, but the fact that they see their fortunes as so dependent upon these kinds of things is a sign, again, of weakness. And if you want to make the parallel to liberalism, that's exactly, to some degree, what liberals did in the 1970s, because they saw the writing was on the wall and their time was coming up. Yes, sir.
Thanks for your talk, also for your writings. I wanted to ask about the book you're finishing or finished on Clarence Thomas. So I think there's a really interesting proposition here because a lot of people see Justice Thomas as a sort of anomaly. When I think, if I'm not mistaken, your argument is that he's a very contingent product of a tension, very profound tension between the radical left and liberalism. And it seems like that tension, in some ways, is very much on display today in a way that it hasn't been, at least in my lifetime. So I'm curious how you view his political consciousness, his racial consciousness, informing race and racism today.
Wow, I think you just gave me my conclusion to this book. I hadn't really thought about it in these terms. But just very quickly, so I am writing this book on Thomas, who has this past as a black nationalist and a fairly radical left past. And what led him to turn to the right in sort of around the mid-1970s, a variety of things, but one of which was, when he was on the radical left, he really loathed American racial liberalism, from the left. And once he made the shift to the right, my argument is that he kept a lot of those assumptions, and so if you read a lot of his jurisprudence, it's very, he gets called kind of colorblind conservative, and nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, a professor in the law school, Tomiko, yes, had a great article a long time ago, actually, I think at this point, maybe 2004, reading one of his decisions. He just is extraordinarily race conscious. My argument in the book is that if liberals always complain, he never speaks. We never know what he speaks. We don't know what he's thinking. And of course, the fact of the matter, he speaks all the time. He gives lectures everywhere, and he has a significant body of opinions, 617 to be exact, if you want to read them. It takes a long time because they're very long opinions. And the reason why I think liberals in the end don't really complain that that he doesn't speak is that they don't want to hear what he has to say, because a lot of what he has to say is very coterminous with a lot of the dominant assumptions of American racial liberalism today. But I think your point, though, that split again between liberalism and the radical left appearing is, I hadn't thought about that I think makes his relevance, once again, more salient on those terms. So thank you. Yes. No, John. Yeah.
Thank you for your time. Your description of conservatism as being, very strongly focused on denying emancipation, denying agency to the subordinate class, sort of seems very immoral and repulsive to someone on the left. So do you think that there's any conservative idea or action that someone on the left would possibly agree with, like, or even work with?
So first of all, let me say that conservatives have a defense of, in fact, they oftentimes complain about this. In fact, Nietzsche was, probably the biggest theoretician of it, that our whole assumption, modern assumption of what morality is dependent upon the equality of all beings, so that anybody who denies that equality seems just automatically to be written off as immoral. And a lot of the conservative project has been to craft a moral defense of inequality, the fundamental denial of the equal moral capacity of all souls. So at its heart, there's that. So are there things, I want to be careful about this. This is such a loaded terrain, the question you're asking. There are certain things that people think of as conservative values. This comes up all the time, namely preservation of existing institutions, right? It's conservative. Well, that's what, you're going to conserve. That, of course, if you look at the history of both liberalism and the left itself, radical worker movements in this country oftentimes framed their moral claims that what capitalism was doing was undoing a world that they had inherited that was a good world. And so their project was one of conservation, of preservation. So I think insofar as people think that that's a conservative value, it's not, because conservatives, that's not the core of the project, but I think that's easily one that preservation can be, under certain circumstances, a perfectly legitimate goal. I think the left gets itself tripped up, though, because I've seen this happen over and over again. They say, so let's frame these things like the environment as care for our common inheritance, and then they go to conservatives and they try to make this case. And of course, they don't give a crap, because conservation of inheritance is not. Just a quick story on this. Some of you may be old enough to remember the television show The Day After, which was about nuclear war and nuclear winter, which came out in 1983. And it was I was in high school, and it was a big deal. We were all very scared of nuclear war. And there was a Nightline broadcast. Nightline, I don't know if that show exists, but Ted Koppel was, and there was a whole discussion. And Elie Wiesel was on it, and he said something about, in 15 years' time, blah, 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 blah. And Bill Buckley, William F. Buckley, jumps in and he says, well, that way he has to speak. Hold on a second there. Notice what you just said. 15 years, that's a very optimistic statement that we have 15 years more to go. So what's all this fuss and concern? And Ted Koppel said, you're an older man. Maybe 15 years sounds like an awful lot to you, but to other people, we'd like to imagine the world continuing beyond 15 years. It's a very revealing moment, though, that shows you the sort of timeline of conservatism. It's like, oh God, the French poet from the 19th century. I've compared it. Oh God, the name just escaped me. With an R. Rimbaud. Yes, I once wrote an article called Rimbaud Politics, playing on Rambo politics. But this just sense, the candle is burning at both ends. Screw it, who cares? And that has oftentimes been this sort of contempt for the ongoingness of everyday life. So there are values. I just don't know how successful we would be in invoking them. Yes.
What role does religion play in conservatism and its project? And is it a means to an end, or is it an end in itself? You can really address it.
Yeah.
And that's our last question.
Okay, so religion is the biggest weakness of this book, because I talk very little about it for many reasons. But what I'll quickly say is, and this kind of broadens the category of religion, conservatism is a modern philosophy. And the premise is that all teleological visions of the universe, that is, a universe that's ordered with God at the top, has really come to an end. And that conservatism has to grapple with that fact. And so I think what conservatism is very successful at, and this has been, provoked a tremendous amount of anxiety in modernity, right? The loss of meaning and all the rest of it. What conservatism does is to take that story of the loss of teleology, the loss of a natural hierarchy, the loss of meaning, and so forth, and connect it to a very specific conception of a social order. And to say that if we restore this kind of hierarchical social order, we will restore that lost world of meaning and vitality and belief that we all once had. And I think that's the real power of conservatism. And so I'm taking a little bit outside of the realm of religion, but just say that the belief in an order of things is fundamentally connected with the belief in a firm hierarchical social order.
Let's hear it one more time.
Thank you.
Thank you.